The balance of power in North America is shifting before our very eyes, and what we're witnessing right now could fundamentally reshape the economic and diplomatic relationship between the United States and Mexico for decades to come. Now, I've been following developments in US-Mexico relations very closely over recent weeks, and I must say, the latest confrontation between the Trump administration and Mexican leadership represents something far more significant than just another trade dispute or border disagreement. What we're seeing is Mexico asserting itself as a sovereign power with its own strategic interests, its own economic leverage, and frankly, its own capacity to push back against what it perceives as overreach from Washington. The traditional assumption that Mexico would simply capitulate to American pressure whenever tensions arose appears to be crumbling. Mexico's government has calculated, quite shrewdly I would argue, that it possesses certain cards in this geopolitical poker game that make automatic compliance neither necessary nor politically viable. This is not merely about tariffs or immigration enforcement. This is about the fundamental recalibration of a relationship that has, for generations, operated under very specific assumptions about which country holds the upper hand. Those assumptions are now being tested in real time. Now, to understand what's happening here, we really need to step back and examine the broader context of how this situation has evolved, because nothing in geopolitics happens in isolation, and this confrontation between the Trump administration and Mexico is no exception. You see, the relationship between the United States and Mexico has always been complex, always been layered with historical grievances, economic interdependencies, and fundamentally asymmetric power dynamics. For most of the modern era, certainly since the end of the Second World War, the United States has operated from a position of overwhelming advantage in this relationship. Mexico, despite being a large country with substantial resources and a significant population, has generally found itself in the position of having to accommodate American interests, American demands, and American pressure on virtually every major issue that has arisen between the two countries. But something has been changing, and it's been changing gradually over the past couple of decades, though many observers in Washington frankly haven't been paying sufficient attention to these shifts. Mexico's economy has been growing, its political institutions have been evolving, and perhaps most importantly, its leadership has been developing a much more sophisticated understanding of where Mexico's leverage actually lies in its relationship with the United States. The election of the current Mexican administration brought to power a government that is fundamentally more nationalist in orientation, more willing to prioritize Mexican interests even when those interests conflict with American preferences, and more capable of articulating a vision of Mexico as a genuinely sovereign power rather than simply as America's southern neighbor that needs to go along with whatever Washington decides. Now, when we look at the specific triggers for this current confrontation, we need to understand that the Trump administration came into this situation with a very particular set of assumptions. The assumption was, quite clearly, that Mexico could be pressured, that threats of tariffs, threats of border closures, threats of various economic sanctions would be sufficient to bring Mexico into line on issues ranging from immigration enforcement to drug trafficking to trade policy. This has been, if we're being honest, a fairly consistent approach from the Trump administration, not just toward Mexico, but toward a number of countries around the world. The theory, such as it is, seems to be that American economic power is so overwhelming, American market access is so valuable, that countries will ultimately cave to American demands rather than risk economic confrontation. What's fascinating about the Mexican response is that it suggests a fundamentally different calculation. The Mexican government has looked at the situation and concluded, apparently, that the costs of capitulation would actually exceed the costs of resistance. This is a remarkable shift in thinking, and it reflects some very concrete changes in the underlying economic and political realities. Mexico is no longer quite as dependent on the United States as it once was. Yes, the United States remains Mexico's largest trading partner. Yes, remittances from Mexicans working in the United States remain important to the Mexican economy. Yes, there are deep integration between the two economies, particularly in manufacturing sectors like automotive production. But Mexico has been diversifying, it's been building relationships with other countries, it's been developing its own industrial base, and crucially, it's been recognizing that it has leverage of its own that it can deploy if necessary. One of the most significant aspects of this leverage relates to migration flows, and this is something that I think is often misunderstood in American political discourse. The conventional wisdom in the United States is that Mexico needs to stop migrants from Central America and other regions from transiting through Mexican territory on their way to the US border, and that therefore the United States can threaten Mexico into providing this service. But the Mexican government has essentially turned this logic on its head. They've recognized that managing migration flows is actually a service that Mexico provides to the United States, a service that has value, and that if the United States wants Mexico to continue providing this service, then the United States needs to engage with Mexico as a partner rather than simply issuing demands and ultimatums. When Mexico decides to reduce its enforcement efforts, when it decides to allow migrants to move more freely through its territory, the immediate pressure falls not on Mexico, but on the United States border infrastructure. This is leverage, pure and simple, and Mexico has demonstrated a willingness to use it. Then we have the economic dimension, and this is where things get really quite interesting from an analytical standpoint. The North American economy is deeply integrated, far more integrated than many people realize. Supply chains for major industries, particularly automotive and electronics manufacturing, cross the border multiple times. A component might be manufactured in the United States, shipped to Mexico for assembly, then shipped back to the United States for further processing, then potentially shipped back to Mexico again, before the final product is completed. This level of integration means that disruptions to cross-border trade don't just hurt Mexico, they hurt American companies, American workers, American consumers. When Trump threatens tariffs on Mexican goods, he's not just threatening Mexico, he's threatening American manufacturers who depend on those integrated supply chains. He's threatening to raise prices for American consumers who purchase products that include Mexican components or Mexican labor. The Mexican government understands this perfectly well, and they've made it clear that if the United States imposes tariffs or other trade restrictions, Mexico will retaliate with its own measures. Now, some observers might think that Mexican retaliation would be largely symbolic, that a smaller economy simply cannot hurt a larger economy in any meaningful way. But this misunderstands the nature of economic warfare in an integrated system. Mexico doesn't need to match the United States dollar for dollar in terms of economic damage. What Mexico needs to do is create enough pain points in politically sensitive sectors that the political costs to the Trump administration of maintaining the confrontation become unacceptable. And Mexico has identified very clearly where those pain points are. Agricultural products from certain states, manufacturing sectors in certain regions. These are areas where targeted Mexican retaliation can create disproportionate political problems for the administration. What we're also seeing, and this is something that I find particularly significant, is that Mexico is not approaching this confrontation in isolation. The Mexican government has been working to strengthen its relationships with other countries, other trading partners, other sources of investment and economic cooperation. There have been increased diplomatic and economic engagements with European countries, with Asian countries, particularly China, with Latin American neighbors. Now, I'm not suggesting that Mexico is about to completely reorient its economy away from the United States. That would be neither feasible nor desirable from Mexico's perspective. But what Mexico is doing is creating options for itself, creating alternatives, demonstrating that it is not completely dependent on American goodwill, and therefore is not compelled to accept American demands unconditionally. The domestic political dimension within Mexico is also crucial to understanding what's happening here. The current Mexican administration has staked a considerable amount of its political credibility on the idea of Mexican sovereignty, on the idea that Mexico will not simply be pushed around by foreign powers, even very powerful foreign powers like the United States. For the Mexican president to be seen as capitulating to American pressure, to be seen as simply doing whatever Washington demands, would be politically devastating domestically. Mexican public opinion is quite sensitive to questions of national dignity and sovereignty, particularly in relation to the United States, and this creates a situation where the Mexican government actually has relatively little room to maneuver, even if it wanted to accommodate American demands. The political costs of being seen as weak in the face of American pressure could well exceed the economic costs of a confrontation, and this fundamentally changes the calculus. Now, from the Trump administration's perspective, this has created something of a dilemma, and I think this is where we see what the title refers to as Trump stumbling. The administration appears to have expected that Mexico would respond to American pressure the way it has often responded in the past, with initial protest perhaps, but ultimately with accommodation. Instead, Mexico has called what it perceives as a bluff. It has pushed back. It has made clear that it's prepared to accept a certain level of economic pain rather than simply cave to American demands. This has left the Trump administration in a somewhat awkward position. If they back down, if they reduce their demands or soften their approach, it could be perceived as weakness. It could undermine the administration's broader negotiating strategy with other countries. But if they escalate, if they actually follow through on their threats, they risk significant economic disruption. They risk a genuine confrontation with a neighboring country that the United States has deep interests in maintaining stable relations with, and they risk creating political problems domestically as American businesses and American consumers start to feel the economic pain of disrupted trade relations. What makes this situation particularly complex is that it's not occurring in a vacuum. It's occurring against a backdrop of broader shifts in the global order. We're seeing increasing multipolarity in the international system. We're seeing middle powers becoming more assertive. We're seeing countries around the world recognizing that American power, while still formidable, is not unlimited, and that there is space for countries to pursue their own interests, even when those interests conflict with American preferences. Mexico's willingness to push back against the Trump administration is part of this broader pattern. Countries are watching this confrontation very closely because it provides a test case for whether American pressure tactics can still reliably produce compliance from countries that are willing to accept short-term costs in order to maintain their long-term autonomy. There's also a very interesting element here related to domestic American politics. The Trump administration's approach to Mexico has always been closely tied to its domestic political messaging, particularly on issues like immigration and border security. The promise was essentially that Trump would be tough with Mexico, that he would force Mexico to pay for border security, that he would compel Mexico to stop the flow of migrants and drugs into the United States. This messaging has been central to Trump's political brand, central to his appeal to his base. But when Mexico pushes back effectively, when Mexico demonstrates that it cannot simply be bullied into compliance, it creates a credibility problem for this narrative. It suggests that the tough guy approach, the art of the deal negotiating style, may not be as effective as advertised, at least not when dealing with countries that have their own sources of leverage and their own willingness to use them. The implications of this confrontation extend well beyond the immediate US-Mexico relationship. Other countries are watching and learning. If Mexico can successfully resist American pressure, if Mexico can defend its interests without suffering catastrophic consequences, then other countries may conclude that they too have more room to maneuver than they previously thought. This could lead to a broader erosion of American influence, a broader questioning of whether American threats need to be taken as seriously as they once were. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're witnessing the collapse of American power or anything quite so dramatic, but we are seeing a recalibration, a recognition that power is more diffuse than it once was, and that even significantly weaker countries can resist pressure from significantly stronger countries if they're strategic about it, if they understand their own leverage, and if they're willing to accept certain costs. Looking at how this situation might resolve, there are several possible trajectories, and I think it's worth exploring each of them because they tell us something important about the current state of international relations. One possibility is that both sides find a face-saving compromise, some kind of arrangement where Mexico makes certain concessions on issues that are important to the Trump administration, but frames these concessions in ways that don't look like capitulation to domestic Mexican audiences, while the Trump administration moderates some of its demands and claims victory based on whatever concessions Mexico does make. This is the diplomatic solution, the traditional way that these kinds of confrontations get resolved. Both sides declare victory, both sides get something they can point to, and the relationship continues more or less as before. But there's another possibility, which is that this confrontation escalates into a more serious economic conflict. If neither side is willing to back down, if the political costs of being seen as weak outweigh the economic costs of escalation, then we could see genuine trade restrictions, genuine economic retaliation, and a significant deterioration in the bilateral relationship. This would be damaging for both countries, but the damage would not be symmetrical, and the question becomes who can sustain the pain longer, who has more political room to maneuver domestically, who has better alternatives available. My assessment, for what it's worth, is that this scenario is less likely than the compromise scenario, but it's not impossible, particularly if there are miscalculations on either side, or if domestic political pressures make it difficult for leaders to back down, even when backing down would be the rational choice. There's also a third possibility, which is that this confrontation leads to a more fundamental restructuring of the US-Mexico relationship. Perhaps the current tensions force both countries to recognize that the old patterns of interaction are no longer sustainable, that a new framework is needed, one that treats Mexico more genuinely as a partner rather than as a subordinate, one that acknowledges Mexican interests and Mexican agency in a more serious way. This would require significant shifts in thinking on both sides, particularly in Washington, but it could ultimately lead to a more stable and more productive relationship going forward. Whether there's sufficient political will for this kind of fundamental rethinking remains to be seen. What's absolutely clear is that we're witnessing something significant here, something that goes beyond just another news cycle, just another diplomatic spat. The way this situation unfolds will tell us a great deal about the current state of American power, about the possibilities for middle powers to assert their interests, and about how international relationships are evolving in an era of increasing multipolarity. Mexico's decision to push back, to resist American pressure, to assert its own interests even at the risk of confrontation, represents a meaningful challenge to assumptions that have governed US-Mexico relations for decades. How the Trump administration responds, whether it adapts its approach or doubles down on confrontation, will have implications that extend far beyond the bilateral relationship. This is a moment of testing, a moment where old certainties are being questioned and where the outlines of a new international order are beginning to emerge. The ultimate resolution of this confrontation will provide important signals about what kinds of power relationships are sustainable in the current international environment, and that's why everyone interested in geopolitics should be paying very close attention indeed,